All right, let's get started. Recipe number 1, aka salt dough, is probably the easiest recipe of these 3 recipes to make because it calls for the most common kitchen ingredients, flour and salt. Start with 3/4 of a cup of water, add 3/4 of a cup of salt, and 2 cups of flour. All that's left is to knead the ingredients together until it's the proper consistency. Now, if you want to add color to your clay, I would do so earlier. I forgot until after I mixed them together. I was able to do it, it was a lot more work, but it did give it kind of a cool marbling effect. This is also a self-hardening clay, which means after it's done, you let it dry, and you're finished. Recipe number 2, craft clay. Start with 1 1/4 cups of water, add a cup of cornstarch, and 2 cups of baking soda. This also calls for simple ingredients, just not as common as flour and salt. Don't forget your food coloring. I used about 15 drops for this blue, and then mix it all together. Transfer your mixture to a saucepan and set it on medium heat for 4 minutes. Now at first, it's going to seem really watery. I thought so too. But as each minute goes by, it'll start to thicken up. You're shooting for a soft mashed potato consistency. When you're finished, scoop it out of the pot, put it onto a plate to cool, and cover it with a damp paper towel so it doesn't dry out. Recipe number 3. We'll call this glue clay. Start with 1/2 cup of cornstarch and add 4 ounces of glue. Now this container of Elmer's was about 8 ounces, and so I drew a line halfway and I eyeballed it. Add your food coloring of choice if you so choose, and mix it up to see what you have. Now because there's no water, this recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil. And if you want to, you can add 1 tablespoon of lemon juice or vinegar, which is a preservative. Then pop it in the microwave for 30 seconds. Take it out and stir to even out the heat, and pop it in for 30 seconds more. By now it should have thickened up, and it's probably looking more like some kind of clay material. Now if your clay is too sticky like mine, you could add more cornstarch. If it was too dry, you could add more oil. Whatever you need, oil or cornstarch, add it, pick it up, and knead it together. And now it's time for some fun. Like I said, I was testing these recipes out to pass along to my students, but I figured my wife and daughter and I could try them out together and have some fun in the process. One might think that all DIY clay recipes are the same, but these 3 clays vary widely in consistency, workability, and overall characteristics. I tried stretching these clays, folding, squeezing, rolling with a rolling pin, cutting in half, bouncing, sculpting, to get a feel for what they could offer, where their weaknesses were, and if any of them were good enough to pass along to my students. Some were stickier, some were softer, some cracked more than others, but they all kind of had their own unique characteristics. I've made a couple of DIY clay recipes in the past, but these 3 recipes surprised me. I could actually roll out coils with these and they stayed together. I did not think any of these would be possible. I thought the glue clay, the green one, would be workable for coils. I expected that, but I did not expect the salt dough or the craft clay to be able to handle coil rolling or everything else I did with it. I rolled out a couple of pebbles and a couple of coils to dry to see how they held up over time. So, how did all 3 clay recipes fare? Here are my thoughts. The best one overall is probably number 1, the salt dough clay recipe. It's a really good overall clay. It's soft when it needs to be, it's stiff when it needs to be. At first it's a little crackly, but the more you work it, the more workable it becomes. Even though it's just flour and salt, it was stretchable until it eventually tore. It has its limits. For simplicity in ingredients and simplicity in making, number 1's the best. The nice thing too is that this clay is easily recyclable, meaning if I have a bunch of pieces I've used, I can mush them together enough times to where it becomes one solid lump of clay again. You wouldn't even know that I used it, and you can't beat the fact that it's just flour, salt, and water with no heating required. Number 2. Now this one might not be the best DIY clay recipe overall, but it's my favorite because of how it feels to the touch. It is smooth and silky, it stretches. It's how I imagine sherbet ice cream would feel if you picked it up in your hands and it wasn't cold. It rolls out nicely, thin or thick. You can sculpt with it. The only downside, sadly, is that it is not very strong when dry. The practice coil that I rolled with just slight pressure broke into many pieces, so it's probably not good for structural building. Now last, and certainly least, the glue clay recipe. It is stiff and springy to the touch, and it has the added bonus of being bouncy, unlike the other two. But at the end of the day, it was extra ingredients, it was a lot more work, and it was a pain to clean the bowl that I made it in. It is the strongest clay, it's the most bendable, the most stretchable, and it almost feels like Play-Doh. But it's the most expensive, it's the messiest, and the most time-consuming to make. So in the end, you decide what you want. So there you have it, 3 DIY clay recipes that you can make at home today. They all have their own pros and cons, and so if you can't decide, make all 3. But if you had to make one, I'd go with number 1, the salt dough. It's the best bang for your buck, it's the easiest, and it requires no heating. Whether you're that parent looking for craft ideas with your kids, the student or the artist looking for a modeling material that's cheap and easy, or if you're the teacher like me, trying to find the best home clay recipe for your students while you're teaching online, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.